This haunting photograph is known as the Holloway twins, a funeral portrait of twins and one of the dead boy who was still breathing. Taken in the Missouri Ozarks in 1874, it was meant to be a final, solemn memory of two sons lost too soon. But hidden within this image of sorrow is a terrible secret born from a father's haste and a family's silent shame. Family legend, whispered for decades, claims that one of the boys, pronounced dead and prepared for burial, took a breath. If a child declared dead was captured on film while still alive, what happened after the camera's flash faded away? If this story has sparked your interest in the hidden truths of history, consider subscribing to our channel to help keep hidden histories alive. We kindly invite you to share in the comments from which city you are watching from and your local time. We are interested to know how far these documented accounts travel. The photograph itself is an artifact of a forgotten time, a small, stiff piece of cardboard known as a cabinet card. To hold it is to feel the weight of over a century of silence. Its sepia tones have softened with age, muting the stark reality of the scene it captured in a small shadowed parlor in the Missouri Ozarks. In the center of the frame sit two infant boys, twins, propped up on a dark upholstered chair. They are dressed in identical long white burial gowns, meticulously sewn with delicate lace at the collars and cuffs. They are the Holloway twins. One child, on the left, appears serene in a way that only the departed can. His face is pale and placid, his chest still, his tiny hands placed gently over his torso. He is the image of a peaceful final sleep, but it is the other boy who draws the eye and holds it in a grip of deep unease, his twin. His eyes are not fully closed. A faint, ghostly line of white is visible beneath the lids, as if he is caught in the moment between seeing and not seeing. His lips are parted ever so slightly. In an era of long photographic exposures, where any living subject struggled to remain motionless, this subtle sign of life might have been dismissed as a blur. But it is not a blur. There is a strange, almost imperceptible tension in his face, a look that is not quite sleep and not quite death. This practice, the photographing of the dead, strikes the modern mind as morbid, but in 1874, especially in the isolated, hard-working communities of the American Midwest, it was an act not of strangeness, but of profound love and necessity. For families like the Holloways, a photograph was a singular event, a luxury they could scarcely afford. Life was a relentless cycle of planting and harvesting, of mending and making do, with little time or money for keepsakes. More often than not, the traveling photographer was summoned not to celebrate a birth or a wedding, but to record a face before it was lost to memory forever. For countless infants who lived only a few days or weeks, the post-mortem photograph was the first and only portrait they would ever have. It was a family's desperate attempt to hold onto a ghost, to prove a child had existed, to give a name in the family Bible a tangible form. It was a solemn, final act of parenting in a world where childhood was the most fragile state of being. The image was a shield against the finality of a small, unmarked grave on a windswept hill. It was a treasure, a testament that a life, however brief, had mattered. The family at the heart of this portrait, the Holloways, were etched from the unforgiving Ozark soil. The father, James, was a man of stern faith and calloused hands, a farmer who met every hardship, drought, flood, or sickness with an impatient resolve. He saw life as a series of problems to be solved, and death as a final, unarguable settlement. His wife, Mary, was quieter, her grief a deep, still reservoir hidden behind a facade of dutiful piety. She had already buried other children, small sorrows that had hardened her heart even as they deepened her faith. Mary was a woman who trusted in God's will, but who also clung to the small rituals and folk wisdom passed down through generations of frontier women. In the days leading up to the photograph, she would have been the one to wash and dress her sons, her movements slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to her husband's restless need for closure. While James saw the photographer's visit as a necessary task to be completed, for Mary it was a final, wrenching moment of connection with the sons she was about to lose. Her quiet diligence masked a constant, gnawing fear that for all her prayers and remedies, she was powerless against the swift, silent illnesses that haunted the region. Life in the Ozark Hills in the 1870 seconds was a constant struggle for survival, a world away from the burgeoning cities of the East. Families lived in near isolation, their lives governed by the seasons and the land. Medical care was a distant hope. Doctors, like the respected but often powerless Dr. Elijah Turner, were circuit riders, traveling on horseback over rough terrain, often arriving long after a fever had broken for good or a labored breath had faded into silence. Their tools were crude, their knowledge limited. Diphtheria, croup, pneumonia, these were not just diagnoses. They were death sentences that swept through homes, often taking the youngest and most vulnerable first. Infant mortality was not a tragic exception. It was an expected, soul-crushing part of life. In this environment, the line between a deep, unresponsive sickness and death itself was perilously thin. A child who grew cold, whose breathing became too shallow to detect, could easily be mistaken for gone. And in a home steeped in grief, with no reliable medical authority to offer a certain verdict, a family's own judgment, or a father's desperate need for an end to the waiting, was often the final word. It was into this world of uncertainty that the Holloway twins were born, and from which one, or perhaps both, departed. The family Bible, the official record of their brief lives, notes 2 baptisms. But the local church ledger records only one burial shortly after. It was James Holloway, sources suggest, who made the pronouncement. Faced with 2 still, silent infants ravaged by fever, he declared them both lost. He was not a cruel man, but a man broken by loss and driven by a need to move forward, to put the tragedy behind him and focus on the living. The photographer was sent for, the solemn portrait was arranged, and the family prepared to mourn 2 sons. But then came the whisper. It was a detail first remembered by their older sister Sarah, a girl of 8 at the time, who saw things the adults, lost in their grief, may have missed. Decades later, she would recall it in a letter to a cousin, a memory that had become a hushed and troubling piece of family folklore. She wrote of the funeral preparations, of the small parlor crowded with grieving neighbors, and of a sound no one was meant to hear, a faint sigh, a ghost of a breath, from one of the small bodies laid out for their final viewing. At first, it must have been dismissed as a trick of the ear, a product of grief and stress. But the story persisted, passed down through generations, twisting and turning until the truth of it was lost in shadow. Suddenly, the photograph was no longer just a memorial. It became a piece of evidence in a quiet domestic mystery. The ambiguous details, the faintly open eyes, the parted lips of one twin took on a chilling new significance. Was this a portrait of 2 deceased children, or a portrait of one deceased child and one who had been mistaken for dead? The camera, with its unblinking chemical eye, had captured a moment of terrible uncertainty. It was meant to provide the Holloway family with a final, comforting image of their sons at peace. Instead, it preserved a question that would linger long after everyone in the room was gone. If one of the boys in the funeral portrait was still breathing, what did his family do when they finally realized their devastating mistake? To understand the terrible dilemma the Holloway family may have faced, we must first step into their world, a world where life was fragile and death was an intimate, ever-present neighbor. In the Missouri Ozarks of the 1870 seconds, medicine was more an art of guesswork than a science. Dr. Three the Rhodes, Place Spravox Wex. Elijah Turner, the local physician, was a man of good intentions, but he was limited by the knowledge of his era. He traveled his circuit with a leather bag containing basic tinctures, a crude stethoscope that could barely detect a faint heartbeat through thick clothing, and a weary acceptance of his own limitations. He knew, as every family knew, that by the time he arrived at a remote homestead, his role was often not to cure, but to comfort and to certify what was already inevitable. The true first responders were the mothers and midwives, women like Mary Holloway, who relied on a patchwork of herbal remedies, passed down wisdom and fervent prayer. They fought fevers with cool rags and battled coughs with concoctions of honey and whiskey. But against the great killers of infancy, diseases we have long since conquered, they were virtually defenseless. Statistics from the period are staggering, suggesting that in some rural communities, as many as 1 in 3 children did not live to see their first birthday. Every parent lived with the chilling knowledge that a healthy child at dawn could be gone by dusk. This grim reality is etched into the scant records left behind. The Holloway family Bible, its pages thin and brittle, contains the names of the twins, Thomas and Edward, their births noted in Mary's careful, looping script. Beside one name, a date of death is recorded just days later, but beside the other, there is only a faint, uncertain mark, as if the hand holding the pen hesitated. This ambiguity is echoed in the town's official documents. The local church ledger confirms the baptism of 2 infants, a moment of hope and consecration, yet it registers the burial of only 1. This discrepancy, a gap in the official story, is where the whispers begin. Decades after the photograph was taken, a letter written by the twins' older sister, Sarah, surfaced among family papers. In it, she recounted the oppressive sorrow that filled their small home. She did not write of a medical diagnosis or a doctor's pronouncement. Instead, she recalled the hushed, frantic movements of the adults and a phrase she overheard, a fragment that haunted her for the rest of her life. The story of an infant who sighed after death. It was a secret kept within the family, a story of a moment so horrifying that it could only be spoken of in the barest of terms. The fear suggested by Sarah's memory was not unique to the Holloways. It was a terror that gripped the collective imagination of the 19th century. The fear of being buried alive. Newspapers and popular magazines were filled with sensational, horrifying tales of individuals waking up in coffins, their cries for help muffled by 6 feet of earth. The poet Edgar Allan Poe captured this primal dread in his stories, tapping into a genuine and widespread public anxiety. This was not mere fiction, it was a plausible threat in an age before modern medical science could definitively distinguish between deep coma and actual death. The panic was so intense that it spurred a wave of morbid inventions. Safety coffins were designed with elaborate systems of bells, flags, and breathing tubes, allowing a prematurely buried person to signal for help from beyond the grave. Societies were formed with the sole purpose of preventing live burial, advocating for waiting periods and more thorough examinations before interment. This cultural nightmare seeped into every corner of society, from the sophisticated parlors of London to the simple, isolated cabins of the Ozark Hills. For a family like the Holloways, already reeling from loss, the possibility that they had made such a catastrophic error would have been a private horror of unimaginable proportions. Viewed through this lens of cultural fear, the 1,874 photograph transforms from a tragic memento into a potential crime scene. Modern forensic analysis of such images, while limited, can reveal details invisible to the naked eye. Experts note the distinct differences between the 2 infants. The child on the left displays the complete lack of muscle tone characteristic of death. His body is limp, held in place only by the careful posing. But the other twin, the one presumed to be Edward, tells a different story. The slight tension around his mouth, the faint furrow in his brow, and the subtle positioning of his hands suggest a residual neuromuscular response. While the long exposure times of Victorian cameras could easily blur the movements of a restless living child, the signs in this image are not of movement, but of a faint, lingering vitality. His stillness is too rigid, too controlled, as if he is in a state of profound unconsciousness rather than true death. A modern physician might see signs of catalepsy, a condition where the body becomes rigid and breathing and pulse become nearly undetectable. Or perhaps it was infant hypothermia, which can slow a baby's metabolism to a point that mimics death. To the grieving, untrained eye of James Holloway, however, it simply looked like the end. This leaves us with the family's stark and telling silence. There is no entry in any county medical log, no note from Dr. Turner describing a miraculous recovery or a tragic mistake. The official record, so clear about the baptism of 2 boys, becomes completely silent on the fate of one of them. This silence is the most damning evidence of all. It suggests an event that the family, and perhaps the wider community, chose to bury, either literally or figuratively. The central question is no longer just whether the child was alive, but what happened in the hours that followed the photographer's visit. Did the faint sigh that Sarah remembered come during the funeral preparations, prompting a frantic, horrified reversal? Or did he survive for a few days more, his life a fragile, unrecorded secret before finally succumbing. The family's shame, especially that of a proud and decisive man like James, may have been so great that the truth was deliberately erased, left to fade into the realm of folklore. The photograph, then, does not capture death. It captures the moment just before a devastating discovery, freezing in time the thin, terrifying line between a fatal mistake and the chance to correct it. For nearly 50 years, the Holloway story remained a ghost, a piece of fragmented folklore confined to family letters and fireside whispers. The photograph sat in albums, its terrible secret dormant. Then, in the 1,920 seconds, the silence was finally broken. A small-town Missouri newspaper, in a column dedicated to local history, published an interview with an elderly Holloway descendant. The woman, a granddaughter of Sarah, recounted the tale she had heard from her grandmother as a child, the story of the twin who moved at the funeral. For the first time, the family secret stepped out of the shadows and into the public record. This published account, combined with the ambiguous genealogical entries, gave historians the threads they needed. The puzzle was no longer just about a strange photograph. It was about reconciling a public record of one death with a persistent family memory of two children, one of whom was pulled back from the brink. The confusion over which twin was which, Thomas or Edward, only deepened the mystery. The surviving twin, Thomas, lived a long but quiet life, forever marked as the boy who had, by some miracle or accident, endured. But the family's narrative left a haunting question. Was he the lucky one, or was he the one who had almost been buried alive, his identity forever conflated with that of his lost brother? The key to this mystery lies not in malice, but in the profound limitations of 19th-century medical knowledge. To a modern doctor, equipped with sensitive stethoscopes, electrocardiograms, and a deep understanding of human physiology, such a mistake seems almost impossible. But to Dr. Elijah Turner, and to a layman like James Holloway, the signs of life were frustratingly elusive. A condition like catalepsy could cause a patient's muscles to become rigid, their breathing to grow so shallow it was invisible, and their pulse so faint it would be undetectable by a simple ear to the chest examination. Similarly, severe infant hypothermia could plunge a tiny body into a state of suspended animation, slowing metabolic processes to a crawl. A baby in such a state would be cold to the touch, unresponsive, and seemingly lifeless. Without the tools to amplify the faint flicker of life that remained, a physician of the 1,870 seconds would have little choice but to rely on what he could see and feel. In the dim, firelit room of the Holloway home, with grief hanging heavy in the air, the stillness of one or both of the twins would have been all the confirmation James needed. His declaration of death was not an act of cruelty, but a tragic conclusion born of certainty in a world that offered none. We are left, then, to reconstruct the chilling scene that must have unfolded after the photographer packed up his heavy equipment and departed. The family, preparing their sons for burial, would have been performing the final, tender rituals of mourning. Perhaps Mary was adjusting a burial gown, or a neighbor was placing a flower in a tiny hand. And then, the impossible happened. A shudder, a soft exhalation of air, a flicker of an eyelid, the sigh that Sarah remembered. The initial reaction must have been disbelief, followed by a wave of electrifying horror. The grief for a lost child would have been instantly replaced by the terrifying realization of their mistake. In that moment, James Holloway's world would have shattered. His decisiveness, his pride, his role as the unwavering head of the family, all would have crumbled in the face of this unthinkable error. The community, gathered to offer sympathy, would have become witnesses to a potential scandal of the highest order. To avoid the shame, the accusations, and the sheer horror of it all, the decision would have been swift and silent. The incident would not be spoken of outside their walls. The living child would be nursed back to health in secret, and the official story, the loss of one son, would be preserved. It was an act of collective denial, a conspiracy of silence designed to protect the family's dignity from a truth too terrible to bear. Ultimately, the Holloway photograph is more than just a relic of a family tragedy. It is a profound testament to the vast gulf that separates our world from theirs. It speaks to a time when life was a fragile, fleeting gift, and death a diagnosis made with fallible human senses. The story forces us to confront the deepest of human fears, not just of dying but of being wrongly declared dead, of crossing a threshold from which there is supposed to be no return. It reflects the universal, desperate need for certainty in the face of loss, and the devastating consequences when that certainty proves false. The progress of medical science has since drawn a much sharper, clearer line between life and death, giving us a confidence that the Holloways could only have dreamed of. Their story reminds us that this certainty is a luxury, hard-won over a century of discovery. The small cabinet card, once intended as a simple portrait of mourning, has become something far more significant. It is a permanent record of human fallibility, a memorial to a mistake born of love and ignorance, and a haunting image of the moment when the past held its breath, caught on the terrifying precipice between the living and the dead.